Hello and welcome. Today we'll be discussing the basics of the waterfall model. First of all, what is the waterfall model? Basically, it is a model that emphasizes a logical progression of steps in the software development lifecycle. It was first introduced by Dr. Winston W. Royce in a paper published in 1970. This model is meant to behave like cascading steps going down an incremental waterfall, so to speak. Implementing a waterfall model within a new software project is a rather straightforward process, as this model has a step-by-step nature. Before we begin in describing the different steps, let me note that different programmers give different names to each individual step, or sometimes split those phases or steps into subphases, but the process of the model is all the same. The first phase of this model is known as the requirements phase. During this initial phase, the potential requirements of the application or program are analyzed and written down in a specification document that serves as the basis for all future development. In simple terms, the requirements of an application are analyzed and stored to be used later for the preceding phases. A while back, I wrote a basic program for a player versus player combat game. In my requirements phase, I illustrated the general flow of events within the sequence of gameplay, and noted methods that I would need to analyze further. The next phase is known as the analysis phase. During this second phase, the system is analyzed in order to properly generate models and business logic that will be used in the application. It's almost like a finalization of the previous phase to analyze the variables and factors within the requirements document. When I entered the analysis phase, I asked myself this question: how do events flow in my program? So the first thing I did is I planned out the logic for my various methods. I didn't use proper coding language, but instead I used words to illustrate the flow of logic within the program. The next phase is called the design phase. This phase largely covers technical design requirements such as programming language, data layers, services, etc. For my program, I decided to write my code in Java, and after making that decision, my worded logic from the previous stage began to transition into Java's coding language. And finally, we reach the coding phase. This phase is very self-explanatory. We're basically coding stuff based on the business logic covered in analysis. We're writing the program. Going back to my example, I translated my worded logic from the analysis phase into actual Java language and continued to program. The next phase is called the testing phase. During this stage, beta testers systemically discover and report issues within the application that need to be resolved. It is not common for this phase to have a necessary repeat in order to remove all bugs within the code. When I wrote my code, I didn't have a team of beta testers to comb through my code to find any errors. But in a less refined way, I used my fellow students at Appleby College to test my code and note any glitches or logic errors they found in my game. Finally, we reached the last stage, known as the operations phase. Finally, the application is ready for deployment to a live environment. The operations stage entails not just the deployment of the application, but also the subsequent support and maintenance that may be required to keep it functional and up to date. My piece of code did not require an operations stage purely because it was an in-class assignment. While the waterfall model has been slowly phasing out over the recent years in favor of more agile methods, it can still provide a number of benefits, particularly for large projects or organizations that require stages or deadlines, which is why I used it for my project in the first place. First of all, this model can easily be adapted to a constantly changing team of programmers. It allows the project as well as a whole to maintain a more detailed, robust scope and design structure due to its upfront planning and documentation stages. This is particularly well suited for large teams that may see new members come and go throughout the project lifecycle. Secondly, it forces an organized structure. While some might argue that this is a burden rather than a benefit, the fact still remains that the waterfall model forces the project to happen, and most likely will result in success if the project is of a huge size. Lastly, it allows for early design change. While it can be a little bit more difficult to make changes later in the process, alterations can immediately be made with minimal effort since there's no coding or implementation that actually takes place until the fourth stage. Overall, the waterfall model is great for programmers or teams who want to have a clear and concise structure when designing an application.